We had 83 seconds left, and the C-17 had already lost both engines. The sentence arrives like a verdict, terse and absolute. The cargo deck was a box of humming lights and hard seams, fluorescent strips throwing halos over pallets and stretchers. Men and women leaned against crates, hands jammed into pockets, faces gone grey in the wash of alarm. Somewhere forward, the flight deck radio spat clipped numbers. Outside, the sky had turned a colour like old steel. Elena Vance sat half-folded on a stack of tied tarps, knees braced, as if she might be reading words no one else could see. She looked for all the world like someone taking a long, quiet break between shifts, a hoodie, a faded ranger patch on one shoulder, hands the kind of calloused most people notice only when they shake them. People who didn't know her saw the hood and the quiet, and they assumed she was shy. People who'd once been under her command called her by the hard nickname Ranger Vance and moved in a tighter orbit. She was not loud. She did not need to be. Her competence had always been small and precise, the kind that slid like light through a keyhole, barely noticed until the lock turned. The alarms had been a geometry of red light and sound. They built like a drumline and then fractured into piercing tones. The first jolt had been a shudder down the spine of the plane, a metallic groan that tasted of old rain on tin. A smell rose behind it. Oil, something chemical and bitter, hot enough to make the back of Elena's throat go dry. The floor under her knees vibrated with 100 tiny things protesting. "Machinery loss," someone said from forward. A voice you had learned to trust instantly, briefed and clipped. Captain Miller, steady as an instrument. The flight deck voices were practiced. Their calm existed by contract until it didn't. "Both engines," Miller said, the syllables small but impossible to mishear. The ship hummed on, the radios filled with numbers. A tone pulsed, 83. A clock in Elena's head clicked forward and then stopped. She catalogued the small facts immediately, because that's what she did. There was a stretch of aisle between two pallets, pinned old blankets, and a med pallet with two people strapped into litter mounts. Mrs. Gable's knuckles were white against a blanket. She kept whispering the same phrase about a garden she couldn't see. A 7-year-old with a crooked cap, Leo, clung to a stuffed animal that smelled like detergent and something floral. Mr. Henderson lay half-turned, a breath peaked, blood dark on his sleeve. Sarah Jenkins had one hand pressed to her mouth and the other to a child's head, as if trying to hold both still. Marcus Halloway was at the forward bulkhead, face lit from below by a tablet. He looked like the sort of officer the public imagines when newsreels roll. Calm jaw, the authority of someone used to being listened to. He glanced at Elena, and that glance had the blandness of someone who'd misread her for years. Beneath Marcus's blandness there was respect, but it had grown quietly, and the habit of dismissal died stubbornly. Elena's training made a light show of the facts. Smoke creeping along the starboard side, a glare from a panel thrown into madness, the cargo hatch stiff as if something tried to beat it open. The deck was tilting ever so slightly, like a ship listing toward a shore. The plane's breath was shallow and hot. 83 seconds, the radio said again, the number more assertion than estimate. Elena let it sink into her like something she could test the edges of. 70 seconds, 50. For some people, those numbers were statistics. For her, each one was a small, heavy thing in the pocket of a coat. She could feel the weight. You couldn't work with numbers and then ignore them. You honored them. You worked the edge. A flashback slid between the alarms. A desert night, too bright under the moon, the hiss of a field radio, and the smell of dust in a throat. She was younger. She had been a medic then and a ranger, and both at once, and the world had been simpler and meaner. A place where somebody else counted on you like a hinge. A man had asked her once whether she slept before missions. She had thought of sleep as an indulgence. You prepared like a machine, and then you made space for the human things later. She remembered the cadence of those operations, 3 words, 1 breath, and how necessary slow breathing could become when everything else was noise. The memory didn't soften her. It made a hard edge where she lived. Back on the cargo deck, she breathed that way now, holding the steady space between inhalation and reality. Her hands were empty. She wasn't supposed to be remote. She had a job title that kept her close to the cargo, to people, to the rope and the strap. But she'd been shuffled into the background on this flight, a logistics crawl, a humanitarian run, where cameras would later call it routine. Quiet competence is often misread as inconsequence until it isn't. "Elena," Marcus said, sliding toward her. "Report." He didn't command. He offered a door. She stepped through. She didn't say a lot. She didn't need to. Her voice had the kind of dry timbre that mapped well to instruction. "Smoke at starboard 2 to 6. 2 litters, 1 critical. Child near center line." She didn't call herself a medic in this moment. She just tallied what was in front of her. Marcus nodded, but the briefness of it exposed the friction they'd always had. He had training. She had the lived kind. The plane was a coffin of metal and time. People who traveled often said that aircraft had moods. This one had an urgency. Spit of flame licked where insulation met skin. The fluorescent tubes above them hummed and then flashed to a high strobe, making everything move in stop frames. Somewhere in the rear, the cargo netting groaned, and they felt the cargo shift like the sound of someone rolling over in sleep. "Captain to crew deck," a voice said with the formal fog of radio speech. "Estimate margin, 83 seconds to loss of controlled flight parameters." Elena's throat tightened at the phrase, controlled flight parameters, because it translated into what she'd always been taught not to say out loud. Loss. The plane now had the texture of a problem with a timer pinned to its heart. She moved with economy, not because she planned to be theatrical, but because wasted motion is a liability. She shouldered through to the med pallet and found Mr. Henderson's pupils pinprick small. She set her palm on his chest and thought about nothing and everything. There were things she could not do here. There were systems beyond her touch and a flight deck that had instruments she would not, could not touch. Her work was narrower. Hold the line. Keep the fragile in place. Sarah Jenkins looked at her with the kind of fear that enters through the eyes first. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, voice thin as wire. Eleanor's reply was lean. "Move them. Clear the aisle. Make breathing space." How she moved them is less important than that she moved them. She didn't explain the physics of cabin airflow or the architecture of flame. She just began to ask for human effort and to marshal it. Soldiers and medics do one thing together better than almost any other group. They accept orders with the knowledge they are keeping each other alive. The minutes folded. The clock in the aircraft's overhead blinked, its numbers a white stare, and Elena started to count in her head. There is a rhythm to counting that strips panic of some of its teeth. 83, 79, 65. The numbers became a beat under everything she did. She would count and move and count and move until the beat stopped. An elderly woman, Mrs. Gable, muttered about a garden she could not get back to. Elena pressed a cool palm to her wrist and found a pulse that was willing still. The kid with the crooked cap, Leo, had large eyes that registered the terror of being so small inside so much metal. Elena caught his gaze, squeezed his shoulder, and in a voice made of cloth and command, told him to look at her and breathe with her. Breath by breath she anchored him, not with explanation, but with presence. The cargo became a landscape of close calls. A pallet shifted and scraped like a thing trying to speak. Someone's oxygen mask hung slack. Soot dusted the fabric of a seat like ash from a candle. The plane's interior became a painting in shades of urgency. Marcus barked orders. Elena listened and then did the next practical thing. She became the fulcrum between the flight deck's technical language and the human space of the cargo hold. She moved like someone who recognized the geometry of survival, not by rote, not by manual, but because the shape of need had been etched into her. Flashback, a rain that kept coming in a place with no roof, and the thin sound of someone crying. Elena under a blanket of camouflage, hands wrapped around a field dressing. She had once made a decision in 3 seconds that cost her months of sleep and a small piece of who she expected herself to be. She remembered the smell of antiseptic and diesel. She remembered a child's whimper that had become a private litany. That memory did not dramatize her. It justified her. It made the muscle of returning to the problem easier and steadier, back to the present. 63, Elena counted, quieter now. Her voice was an instrument plugging into the deck's noise. People began to move differently around her, not in worship, but in the useful way people gravitate towards someone who knows the answer to a problem their training didn't prepare them for. She found a roll of cargo straps, a spare med kit, a child's small jacket. Nothing miraculous, nothing specialized, just things that could be woven into an immediate solution of human terms. Shields against smoke, something soft under a head, a rough splint. She did not think about how she might be charged later for any improvisation. There would be time for forms and questions after. Right then, the ethos was more elemental. Keep the breath, keep the person. Marcus glanced at her, half surprised and entirely grateful. "Get the child," he said. He didn't give her time to object. Elena moved toward Leo. The child tried to wrap his small fingers around the toy. Elena traded it for her own glove, folding the fabric around a thumbnail like a small loan of calm. She put the glove in his hand and let him hold it. Symbols are important to children. They help them believe someone is on the other side of the terror. 49, someone called from the cockpit. The number sliced the air. The overhead lights began to flicker in a new rhythm, like a heart jammed by static. The plane's skin felt too close, like a suit someone had zipped around them in panic. Elena noticed small betrayals of the body. A tremor in her hands, the way her jaw ached when she forced one of those disciplined breaths. She had been through this template before, a dozen tight frames of decision where the body wants to retreat and the mind insists you don't leave the person behind. There was a cost written in her bones. She had come home from other missions with stitches sewn into the inside of her life. She'd learned to make space for the aftermath later. Now was not later. 36, the radio said, the voice flat. Time compressed into something like an elastic string being pulled. The closer it pulled, the louder the snap. A wrenching sound came from near the starboard wall, something metallic shuddering. A small fire bloomed near a cargo edge, an orange tick of merciless color. It was not large now. It radiated, it smoldered. The heat was an obvious presence, like a second passenger in the plane. The crew fed on the small facts and then moved. A human chain formed, hands grasping wrists, people swapping positions in the space like pieces in a game played at low light. Elena's mind narrowed to a surgical focus. She had a mantra she used inside chaos: ignore the pain, act on the objective. The phrase was not a hate of feeling, it was a practical lever. She felt the ache of a bruise she didn't know she'd acquired, a ribbon of tenderness across her ribs. She ignored it because someone needed to be the bridge. There are things you never learn in training manuals, things you learn in the school of people who live the worst hours. One of them is how quickly shame follows the person who freezes. Elena made a tiny calculation of shame and found it unacceptable. She swallowed it. The fear of being silent in a moment of demand pressed at the back of her teeth, but she kept moving. 25, the flight deck said. A clock in the bulkhead chirped and stuttered. A creak went along the fuselage like some animal shifting. The flames flared. Smoke rolled along the ceiling in a lazy wave, then burned into the beams, and then into the mouths of the ventilation. People began to cough, the sound ragged and animal, and someone, Marcus perhaps, found a handful of cloths and began tamping them over faces. Elena thought of the small, practical things that can stop panic. Eye contact, a firm voice, a hand placed on a clavicle to remind a person they are tethered. Another flashback. A night raid, their unit moving through a compound, her hands steady on a man's chest, while someone else handled the noise outside. She remembered the way a friend had once said that being a medic means carrying the knowledge that the human heart will obey if you ask it to. It wasn't poetry, it was a bench of hard facts and stubborn hope. The plane lurched, people skidded, the sound of their bodies against metal like a singular, terrible percussion. A hush fell that had the hollowness of being watched by everything. Elena looked up and saw the overhead panel flare like a constellation, small lights like judgments. Her ears rang with a high pitch that she could not find a name for. Her watch said 20 seconds. 20 seconds to what? She didn't know. The number now felt like the teeth of a saw. At 19 seconds, she made a decision that would be told in different tones later, practical, raw, and small. The choice itself was not theatrical. It was a kind of sacrifice because she understood the cost. A person could be put between harm and safety only by another's willingness to take on exposure. She reached for Leo. The child's face, lit by emergency lights, looked like a planet in a dim sky. Elena clamped a hand around his shoulder and hauled. She moved with the economy of someone who'd made a life out of moving others without fanfare. Marcus saw it and didn't argue. He pulled a tarp and created a sliver of cover. Sarah, with shaking hands, wrapped a jacket around the child's face like a small mask. The motions were not the sorts of things that instruction manuals could praise or admonish. They were just what humans did when the countdown reduced them to essentials. The plane bucked a final awful time. The lights cut low, a loud thud, and then a change in the cabin's pressure that felt like being shoved downward. The numbers on the overhead clock blinked 10, 9, 8. Elena's lungs worked harder. She felt the rawness in her chest like a bruise made of wind. She did not have time for fear. She had time for another calculation. The cost she was about to accept was not a hero's flourish. It was practical and honest and would leave a mark. She slid under a hanging strap and wedged herself so that she could shelter a person from the worst of the smoke, and at the same time be able to pull them if the opening presented. Her actions were not a recipe. They were a risk born from training and from memory and from the muscle habit of people who have learned to act when the world was on the edge. A voice came through, fragmented and strained. "Brace positions," the flight deck said. The call was a formal string of words. Elena did not brace in the way the manuals described. She braced with her body wrapped around a child's breathing. Her arms locked like a clamp, and she felt each thin breath as if it were a vital instrument. 7 seconds, 6. The overhead chirped like a dying bird, and then quieted, leaving only the thrum of human bodies and someone's low sob. Smoke pooled at the top of the cargo bay like ink. Their faces were smudged with it, but their eyes were bright and awake. Then the craft did something Elena could not name. It made a movement like surrender and like defiance at the same time. The cargo hold felt the change in an instant, and then another. The floor pitched, and their world became a series of angled planes where people slid and clung and called names. Elena felt a sharp pain in her side as she braced. It was a clean thing with no drama, and bright with the possibility of complicating the hours after. She ignored it, because a child's small chest was under her hands, and the breath there mattered more than whatever would come afterward. The sirens outside, the ones on the ground, had not yet arrived. All they had was each other, the flight deck, and the small instrument of seconds that had been glinting like a knife. The plane's belly groaned, and then seemed to draw a long breath of its own. At 3 seconds, the radio came through with a voice that sounded like it came from outside the world. "Brace, brace, brace." The word was more than instruction. It was a small liturgy of hope. And then the world slowed. Elena felt the seconds thicken, not into calm, but into the strange clarity that comes when one is fully present and everything else becomes peripheral. Time narrows when you have to choose, when you have to become the instrument for someone else's survival. The plane hit in the way all such collisions had a sound one could never fully describe, a metallic complaint and a weight that moved through the bones. The deck bent under them. Something tore. Someone shouted a name and then another. Elena held against the motion and felt a pressure that was not just mechanical but human, as if the plane itself had recognized the small business of mercy and wanted to participate. For a jagged moment the world was a single, bright note. Elena's teeth clenched. Leo's small hand tightened around hers like a rope. Mrs. Gable's whispers grew louder, more insistent. Mr. Henderson's breath got ragged and then steadied, as if someone had mended the rhythm with a small, invisible stitch. When the first shock subsided, the cabin was full of a different, quieter sound. The ragged breath of survivors. Some were crying, some were motionless. Their bodies had gone rigid in a way that looked like prayer. The overhead clock's numbers scrambled and then remained blank, as if it had been stunned into silence. Elena uncurled just enough to check for the child's pulse. It was there, small, willing. She let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding, the sound more private than anything else in the room. But the crisis was not over. The plane was still wounded. Smoke was still thick along the ceilings. Forward, the flight deck's voice came, thin and strained. "We're committed to a forced descent," Miller said, a phrase that landed hard because it implied there would be more to happen in the next breaths. There would be decisions and outcomes and things that only later could be named with relief or sadness. Elena pressed her forehead to the child's cap and felt the heat and the beat. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the aftershocks of exertion. Around her, people were doing the small acts that had been begun. Marcus moved among them like a man resetting chess pieces. Sarah had tears on her cheeks, but her hands were steady. Someone coughed a deep, wet sound. Someone else whispered, "You're all right," as if reciting both encouragement and a spell. And as the plane bled altitude, as the world outside grew nearer and the instruments relayed a string of clipped professional syllables, Elena tasted something metallic in the back of her teeth. She felt a hot stitch across her ribs, a blooming tenderness. It would be there after. It would cost her sleep and make her flinch when a door slammed. But in that moment it was simply a measurement. She registered it, and then set it aside. The countdown motif that had been drumming through the cargo hold, the 83 seconds that had been called early and then iterated like a prophecy, had done its work. It had sharpened the room, made them act like people who understood the price of hesitation. It had not provided answers. It had reminded them of the only way to buy more time, the small alchemy of risk and action and faith. Elena sat up, eyes scanning the hold. There were faces she had not yet touched. There were people forward, who she could not reach without passing more flame. The plane's bow dipped and then stabilized into a firmer angle. Earth's face came up through windows as a band of cloud, and then something hard, a promise. She found Marcus and didn't ask for direction. She looked at him for a long, sharp second and saw respect there, finally making a home in his face. "We hold them," she said. "Keep them breathing. I'll go forward when there's a window." He nodded, the movement slow, as if the years of misreading had been sanded down in a single instant. He stepped back into his role and began to marshal people with the old efficiency. Elena's hands went to the strap near her hip. She gathered the small tools within reach and slid toward the forward hatch, not because she wanted to be a front-page hero, but because the forward hatch was where the plane's secrets sometimes bared their teeth, and because someone had to be there to read the next set of small facts. The flight deck radio gave a string of numbers that sounded like a countdown, and also like a name. She had the taste of diesel and burnt fabric in her mouth. Her lungs burned. Her ribs sent a dull, uncooperative reminder of past hurts. She didn't imagine herself invincible. She imagined herself present. A thin crack of light appeared at the forward entrance as someone opened a panel and then closed it. The plane had settled enough that movement forward was possible, but compromised. Elena slipped through with the careful posture of someone who knows the value of minimizing exposure. 10, the flight deck said, and the number ricocheted off the metal walls of her skull. She crawled forward, was handed a radio, and for the first time in hours heard a voice that trembled. "External rescue inbound. Unknown on time," said a voice that made the crew exchange looks that had gratitude laced with doubt. Elena pressed the radio to her ear and felt the weight of 1,000 small decisions pressed like a glove against her palm. The plane was bleeding altitude and clarity both. She thought of all the hours between now and landing when they'd be asked to perform again and again, each small measure a coin spent. She thought of how, in the quiet that would come later, she might count the costs and find them heavy. But there was no quiet then. The cargo hold was full of human breath and small acts. The plane's skin groaned as it began to align itself with the earth below. The radio crackled with tones that made everyone listen harder and hold the good in their palms like talismans. Elena's mind moved to the next set of choices. There were people forward who would need getting clear. There were flames that would have to be kept from spreading. There was the small, impossible decision about whether to become the physical shield for another and risk being separated from her own chance to be rescued intact. She thought of nothing, then everything, and then made a motion that was both ordinary and sealed with intent. She rose, shoulders set, and walked back into the hold where the faces she had already held were waiting. She moved like someone whose life had been composed of small roads leading to a bridge. She had built enough such bridges to know the weight a single person could carry. The plane's descent continued, and the world outside grew hard. The engines had gone silent in a way that made the entire body of the aircraft feel transparent. There would be an end to this, and an assessment after, and the world would write stories of courage and will. For now, there was only the next breath, the next small utility of human will. 83 seconds had cut the flight into 2 worlds, before and after. They had lived inside the number, and it had made them act like people who keep one another alive. The farther truth, whether the plane would reach the ground in a way that allowed breath to continue for all of them, remained to be written. She moved through the hold again, checking, steadying, anchoring. Her hands found the straps and the jackets and the small hands that reached up. She placed them where she could. Then, a few paces forward, she paused and looked up toward the flight deck. The light from the window was a thin, precise white. The radio hummed like a distant insect. 3 minutes to impact zone, came a voice, measured and awful. Impact zone. The phrase had a gravity that told you what the next scene would be like, but it didn't say how soft it could be made, or how many breaths could be saved. Elena took a breath and let it out slowly. She felt the ache in her ribs as a sign that she had done work with her body. It would mend with time, but there would be scars and nights where the memory tugged. She accepted the cost the way a person accepts tax, necessary and unavoidable. She moved back to Leo, whose eyes, wide and old in their dampness, caught and held hers. "Look at me," she said, and the voice was a thread that tethered the child to the present. Leo's hands curled in her glove, and the small body leaned into the protection like a thing choosing safety. Behind her, Marcus called out names of those who would come first when the plane settled. The injured, the children, the elderly. There was a structure now, a sequence being formed. It was not perfect. It was enough. "Prepare for a heavy landing," the radio said, as if naming the next truth would make it manageable. Elena swallowed. The words had the bluntness of a hammer. She felt, with the peculiar cold clarity that arrives in extreme moments, the way her life had been shaped for this instance. The Rangers teach you discipline. The medics teach you to listen. Life had given her both. She straightened, shoulders back, and met the look of the young crew members as if to say, "We will do this together." The aircraft braked itself, and the world outside narrowed. Instructions came and were followed. Hands found hands. Breath steadied into a rhythm that was human and stubborn. And as the plane readied for the final sequence that would determine whether their 70 or so souls would step into light or darkness, Elena counted the last numbers in her head and held, like a small, fierce oath, the child whose breath lay under her palm. The narrative at this moment hangs on a fulcrum. The plane will find its ground. People will be asked to move and to hold and to make the small and terrible decisions that separate survival from tragedy. Elena's choice to put herself between smoke and child, to be the person who takes on exposure so that another can have a chance, that is the hinge on which what follows will turn. She felt the alloy of fear and resolve solidify into a certain kind of courage. It was not the heroic stuff of cinematic ribbons. It was the blunt, honest courage of someone who knows the math of a human life. Below them, the world thickened, and the plane prepared to make contact. The rest of the story would be the messy, human aftermath of that contact. Names called, doors opened, hands reaching, sirens wailing. But in this hold of metal and breaths, Elena tightened her grip and readied herself, and the 83 seconds that had been given them became a baton passed quietly from one set of hands to another. The plane found the ground the way a winter branch finds the road, with a sound that was all the world compressed into one terrible metallic note. The landing shook them the way a bell shakes a belfry, a full, uncompromising toll that ran down spines and into teeth. The cargo floor stuttered, people slid and grabbed and then steadied in ways that felt like prayer. Elena felt the weight of it in her ribs and in the places that habit had taught her to keep still. She was aware mostly of breath, her own, Leo's small chest under her hand, the measured gusts of the man they'd been trying to keep steady. Outside, lights moved like an answering choir. The ground crews hadn't been a promise so much as a thing they had to make come true. Now they arrived as the plane's exterior opened into a wash of sounds and precise chaos. Doors yawned, boots hit metal, voices called names. The C-17, scarred and spent, lay in a grey light that took away any glamour from the notion of heroism. It became instead a place where choices had been made and people had moved, because movement was the only honest reply to the threat. "Medical forward ramp," a voice called. It was procedural, boringly correct, the kind of language built to keep panic under a lid. But the tone carried relief like warm bread. The ramp dropped, and the mouth of the plane became a corridor for rescue. People hauled themselves up or were lifted. Some stumbled, some laughed in a raw way, some wept. Elena pulled herself free of the child's small body with the reluctance of someone unplugging from a life support that had been human, not mechanical. A medic knelt beside her quickly, practiced hands sweeping for blood and broken bones, asking the clipped questions that belonged to triage. Elena answered where she could. Her side bled warmth into her palm when she pressed to check for broken ribs, and a radiating ache spread through her shoulder from the way she had held position. None of it registered as severe at first glance, the small, persistent injuries of people who have been used and useful. She let the medic press a dressing into place and felt the small indignity and the immense gratefulness of being tended by another's hands. Leo was the first to be brought out, swaddled now in clean fabric, his hair a little singed at the edge, but his eyes huge and bright. He saw Elena, and his tiny face made a new sound that was part laugh and part sob. He reached for her, and she took his hand again, as if the world had made this the single most normal thing. He squeezed, a secret little fist that told her he remembered the glove she'd given him, and the way she had guided his breathing to match her own. Around them, people shuffled and hugged and looked at one another with that strange, immediate love that follows shared terror. If you had been waiting for sirens and cinematic helicopters and stage lights, the truth was more mundane and truer. Beakers of coffee, blankets, flashlight cones, 1,000 small acts. The firefighters worked with their methodical instruments and their practiced ruthlessness, smothering smouldering pockets with wet blankets, checking seams and straps. They moved without fanfare, but with a quiet ferocity. Flight crew checked manifest and names, and then began to shepherd the survivors through a cordon where ambulances waited like patient beasts. Marcus moved in a loop around the wounded and the shaken, his mouth set, barked orders reduced to briefings to those whose faces had not yet learned what the afternoon had taught them. He looked at Elena with a complicated expression, part relief, part debt, part the long-delayed admission of having been wrong to keep her in the shadows before. He reached for her hand as if to steady himself, and in that brief human gesture there was an apology that did not need the language of papers and reports. "Sit," he said simply, as if the choice had been obvious all along but undiscovered until now. She sat on a folding cot, the world angled and loud and then very small. Her breath came in that shape they all recognized, slow, forced into discipline. Leo gravitated to the cot and leaned his head against her knee. He had a small band of blue tape across his knuckle. He traced it with a thumb and gave her a grin that was as much a private bravery as any medal. If this kind of story keeps you leaning in, subscribe for more accounts of quiet courage, real people, close calls, and the small, human choices that hold the line when systems fray. There's no spectacle promised, only witness. They worked outward from the plane, like surgeons on a table no one had chosen. The elderly woman who had murmured about gardens was wrapped in a blanket and talking in little precise fragments about roses and the way soil smelled in the rain. Mr. Henderson's sleeve had been replaced, and he breathed with less of a jag now, his forehead sweat-sheened, but his voice steady when he laughed at some private joke. Sarah, whose hands had trembled earlier, sat with a stretcher draped across her knees and let her head fall into the crook of Marcus's shoulder, the air leaving her body with a sound like a cord released. Elena's side throbbed when she shifted, a reminder that nothing happens without the body keeping score. Someone pressed a styptic pad to a bruise and said the words people say to hold space. "You're okay. You're safe." The truth of that sentence was a variable condition, contingent on hours and diagnostics and the slow bureaucratic arithmetic that sorts wounds into healed and not yet healed. For the moment it felt like medicine. On the ramp, reporters hovered at a respectful distance, lenses trained on the tableau. A cameraman with a soft face and a woman whose hair was windblown near his side asked questions into microphones that always seemed too cheerful. They wanted a narrative arc, cause, hero, outcome. The plane and its people refused to be neat. Marcus answered with the compressed professionalism of a man who had been taught to make words economical. He said what was needed: gratitude for those who'd helped, praise for the crew, a promise of thoroughness. Elena watched rehearse herself into sound and felt a familiar distaste for the way stories sometimes require simplification. Through all of it, Leo's small hand never left hers. Each time she winced, he looked up. "You kept me," he told her once, with the utter simplicity of a child giving a verdict. "You kept me safe." Elena tilted her head and let herself receive the sentence without turning it into something larger than it needed to be. "We kept each other," she said finally, and it was as much truth as she could manage. People liked tidy heroes, but the truth lived in the messy center of human chains, in the way strangers had lent shoulders and coats without waiting for a commendation. They moved the injured to a triage tent, where medics with red crosses took charge. Eleanor answered questions in clipped, clear sentences, while the medic checked her pupils and asked about medication and allergies. She said yes to pain, noted the place that felt sharp. She did not make it the center of the story. For her, pain had a job. It told you where the body was angry about what had just happened. A volunteer offered her a cup of something that tasted of burnt coffee and kindness. She drank it with hands that still bore ash. Around her, conversations began that would later form the skeleton of the public account. There was a serious engine failure, someone said, cautious with blame, generous with the details they were vetted to supply. Quick descent, someone else offered. But the people in the tent were not interested in the language of aviation investigations. They were interested in whether the child's heartbeat had been steady and whether Mrs. Gable had stopped muttering about her garden. Over the next hours, as ambulances ferried people to regional hospitals and the survivors trickled into designated shelters, word moved down the chain in the way urgent things do. There were no banners yet, but there were messages catalogued in the way of practicalities, lists of blood types, names of children, phone numbers to call. The task of turning chaos into lists that would become letters or condolences or forms, began in a room of tired hands and clean clipboards. Elena let herself be examined more completely later, in a mobile medical van that smelled of antiseptic, and faintly of the coffee they'd kept offering. An X-ray technician with a steady smile showed the film of her ribs. Nothing snapped, nothing catastrophically broken. The soreness was a complaint rather than a diagnosis. A nurse wound a sleeve around her where a bruise wanted to bloom. She accepted the dressing because to refuse would have been to treat herself as if she were different from the others. She was not different. She had a brief, brittle wave of nausea in the quiet of the van that she recognized as the body's way of writing a note to memory. This mattered. The bile taste of diesel and singed fabric came up like an old postcard. She closed her eyes and let it go. The moment passed like a flinch. When the worst official statements had been given and the cameras were escorted away from the immediate corral, a hush settled over the group that would later be called survivors. Marcus found Elena then, and without witnesses, drew her aside. His face was close and honest now, stripped of the official self he wore in the press. He said what people find awkward to say aloud in the public square. "You saw things the rest of us didn't. You moved before we knew we needed to move. Thank you." Gratitude is a complicated thing to receive. It implies debt, recognition, an accounting that sometimes every person tries to avoid. Elena looked at him and saw the man who had judged her quiet as disinterest. Now his eyes said he had been wrong. There was an exchange of small words, "We did okay," that held more tenderness than either would admit later. Marcus reached up, placing a hand briefly over hers, a contact that meant more than a nod in a debrief. The logistics after any event of this scale are endless and oddly intimate. Families had to be reunited. Phones were charged and handed back to trembling fingers. People smoked cigarettes that tasted like contraband catharsis. Someone produced a thermos with soup, and the act of passing the cup around felt like an offering to the rawness of the afternoon. Leo's mother found them in the tent some hours later, eyes ringed, and the breath of someone who had feared a particular kind of cosmic cruelty. She pressed her small son to herself, then looked up at Elena with speechless gratitude. Tears came, and she said plumbing sentences, "You kept him," as if in repetition the truth could find itself more solid. Journalists would later try to construct their narrative arcs. The quiet woman who became an instrument of salvation, the tense minutes turned into a clockwork of heroics. But the plane's immediate true story was more modest. A dozen people moved, a child's breath held, an older woman's fingers smoothed, a man whose bleeding had slowed. The after-image of those small acts was more telling than any grand pronouncement. Night fell, and with it came a coldness that made everyone tighten their jackets and their stories. Elena lay on a cot in a shelter set up for the survivors, the fabric of the tent whispering overhead. Her body hummed with exhaustion, that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with the kinds of choices she had made earlier. Her mind, which had not permitted panic while the plane still demanded it, now allowed a thin tendril of thought to unwind into memory. Flashbacks came like rain in thin sheets. She saw again the desert night where she'd first learned to keep a man alive who till then nobody had considered savable. She felt the ache of a younger self that had assumed invincibility because the rules had seemed simple then: prepare, move, save. She had come home with ribbons of loss tucked into pockets she barely opened. The years after had been a series of small reckonings: appointments, quiet nights, old friends who had drifted, and colleagues who measured competence in loudness. The cost of that geography had been the softening of the public face she presented. Quiet seemed safer, cheaper. She had not expected that safety to become worth something in the way it now did. Someone folded a blanket over her legs. It was Mrs. Gable, who, despite the exhaustion in her voice, said it plainly. "You kept my breath." She looked at Eleanor as one might look at an old neighbor who had remembered to pass by with a loaf of bread. There was neither sermon nor fanfare in it. It was simple currency between two people. The next day was a slow succession of forms and statements. There would be hearings of an organizational kind, lists of maintenance checks, and recorded call-outs. Investigators came and asked careful questions that respected the border between curiosity and accusation. Elena gave her account, sensory details, the order of movements, the way smoke had climbed and where people had been situated. Her answers were candid and spare. She refused to be a myth. She insisted on being a human who had done the work required. Recognition came not as a single, headline-friendly blast, but as a string of quieter things. A commander with a steady voice came by and, on behalf of the unit, offered a folded commendation and a handshake. He said in a tone that was the institutional version of human thanks that their lives had been spared because of actions taken in the hold. Marcus stood beside her, and with the casual cruelty and tenderness of men who have worked in units together, called her Ranger with affection now stripped of any of its old sting. The survivors gathered afterward in a hall filled with warm light. The civilians who had been aboard spoke softly about fear and gratitude. Staff took down names and gestures of thanks. Leo, who might have been expected to be sullen from shock, made a small drawing and presented it to Elena in public, little stick figures, a sun, and the number 83 scrawled like a signature. He explained, because children feel the contour of stories too quickly, that 83 was not scary now. It was a good number, because it was the number that had told them how to move, and because someone had put a hand on his breathing. Elena kept the page folded in her jacket like a talisman. For days, the edges of sleep were jagged. She woke to the taste of smoke and lay there with the residual sense of the plane's motion vibrating along her bones. When she walked into the hangar later to see the aircraft that had given them so much trouble, it looked less like a machine and more like a scarred animal. Men and women in reflective vests moved around it with gauze and careful tools, murmuring the language of repair. And she stood a little off to the side, feeling a small, private pride that had nothing to do with cameras or medals. The public's appetite for stories is slippery. At times there was a flurry of attention, profiles, interviews, phrases that tried to distill human complexity into an easily consumable line. Eleanor avoided most of it. She preferred small rooms with honest faces. There is less glory in that choice, but more truth. When she did consent to a short interview, she spoke plainly. "We did what was necessary. We reacted to the people in front of us." It was not false modesty. It was an accounting from someone who had learned that narrative simplicity often hides the contributions of many. After the initial rush, the machinery of routine reasserted itself. Elena returned to work within a span that felt both too soon and precisely right. A few weeks, during which she caught the odd look of those who had once misread her as timid. Their expressions now carried that sharp, almost embarrassed respect that people show when a long-held assumption is corrected. There were, as ever, small costs. The bruise in her side flared when the weather turned cold. Night sweats visited her like unwanted messengers. Sometimes she found herself tracing the line of a strap on her hand in the middle of the night and, absurdly, counting down from 83. The number had become a nested thing, a clock of memory, a measure of what bravery costs. She learned to let the number come and go without letting it decide her hours. Months later there was a modest ceremony. It was not a gala. It was a room in which handshakes were given and medals handed out in a way that could make anyone who wore them feel both seen and slightly uncomfortable. Elena stood with Marcus and Captain Miller, with Leo and his mother in the audience. There were a few words about courage and coordination. She accepted the small emblem they pinned to her chest and felt the absurd, sweet heaviness of it. It would not heal the bruises nor the nights, but it was a ledger entry in the world. Someone had recognized what had been done. Later, standing alone on a stretch of tarmac while the sun slid toward its evening angle, she watched the C-17, patched and inspected, being towed away. The aircraft bore its scars like a veteran bearing medals that nobody had bothered to clean. She thought of the many hands who had pulled at it, the flight crews, the firefighters, the volunteers, the medics who had smoothed blankets over trembling shoulders. The plane had been a place of terror, and also of a strange, rigorous generosity. It had demanded everything, and, through the actions of the people within it, given something back. Leo came up on the far side of the fence with his mother and waved. He had a new hat now, one that was too big for his head. They called to her, and he lifted his small drawing, still slightly crumpled, and shouted across, "Thank you!" She walked over the fence, and he ran to her, arms open. He hugged her with the kind of wholeheartedness that heals with blunt force. They spoke for a long time in the evening air. He told the story of how he had kept the glove in his pocket for 3 days. He wanted to know if the sky was always dangerous. She answered as honestly as she could. "It can be," she said, the truth feeling like a stone she carried in a pocket. "But people make it safe sometimes when they choose to move for one another." He considered this with the gravity of a child who has seen something too big and found a small key for it. "Like you?" he asked. She looked at him. She thought of nights where she had tried to stitch pieces of herself back together with small, practical threads. Gardening hands, kitchen hours, the thin ritual of making coffee for neighbors. "Like all of us," she said. "Sometimes one person takes on a little extra, but it only works if everyone helps." When she finally let herself go back inside, the hangar lights turned on in a slow sweep. Elena moved through them and felt that, in a way she couldn't fully articulate, something had changed in the air around her. People now saw her with a little less misreading in their eyes. That was not the same as being famous. It was fuller, more durable, the sort of recognition that might survive paperwork or time or the forgetting that so often followed high drama. The scars remained. There were nights when the memory visited with unfair clarity. She learned the techniques that do not belong to manuals, being gentle with herself, letting a moment of panic pass without surrendering to it, letting someone else make coffee in the morning and accept that offering without feeling it devalued her. She kept the drawing Leo had given her folded in her wallet. On bad days, she slid it out, traced the clumsy number 83, and felt that pulse of something that had tied a room together, a number that had become a promise. Months later, when the reports had been filed and the headlines trimmed for space, an investigator spoke to Elena in a small, careful room. He wasn't looking for blame as much as answers to the question everyone had. Why did the plane survive? She gave her recollection, but the thing she said best came at the end, as if it had been rescued from a crowd. "It wasn't the plane," she told him. "It was the people inside it. Machines fail. People make up the difference." His face softened. "Yes," he said, "that's what we'll be writing." She didn't watch for the story's final cut. She let the public narrative be public and chose instead to keep to the private and the practical. She attended a small memorial for those who had been hurt more severely elsewhere. She visited the families who had lost possessions and, in some cases, much more. She learned to take the space of gratitude and not let it become vanity. A year after that day, on an afternoon that felt ordinary and therefore in some way miraculous, she stood in a small garden that had been given to the crew by a local community group. It was modest. A patch of earth with a few raised beds, a bench, and a tiny plaque that read simply, "For those who keep others breathing." She planted a small shrub with careful hands. The soil was dark and rich and smelled of rain. Mrs. Gable was there, her hands more delicate but sure. Leo ran around the beds and put his hands into the dirt like a promise. Marcus and Captain Miller were there with cups of coffee they pretended to be casual about. Elena's fingers were dirty, and she didn't mind. The act of planting felt like an answer to something she'd not known to ask. You put a living thing into the ground, and you make a place that demands time. It was a way, she thought, of measuring a life that had been broken into minutes and now sought a long, green unfolding. On the bench, she set Leo's drawing between the dirt and the bench leg, as if that small slate of paper were a talisman that would bless the bed. She had coaxed it into a lamination when no one was looking, the childish scrawl made permanent in plastic. It was ridiculous and appropriate. She liked that. "We had 83 seconds left," she murmured to nobody in particular. The number had lost none of its gravity, but it had shed some of its ability to terrify. It had been a sharp instrument in the day that changed things. Now it belonged to the archive of what had passed. She smiled without trying too hard and watched the shrub settle into its new burrow. The auction of attention had long since moved on to the next crisis. The plane's scars were tended by hands that understood metal and stress. The people who had been aboard folded their memories into private narratives. Elena returned to duty sometimes, and to ordinary life more often. She took shifts that required paying attention and others that required kindness. She did not pretend she had paid nothing for the day. She kept the bruise as a souvenir, and the drawing as an heirloom. On quiet nights, when sleep was unbroken and the world seemed to breathe easy, she thought of the plane, of the way lights had pooled like a net, and the hush that came afterward. She thought about how small kindnesses had made the difference between a number and a life. She thought of Leo's glove and the wad of clay used as a makeshift filter and the tight economy of movement that had carried them through. She thought of the phrase she had used in the cargo hold, "Ignore the pain. Act on the objective," and how, for all its utility, it had become something she needed to unlearn sometimes. There is a cost to moving so quickly to shelter others. The brain is an accountant and keeps entries. On a late afternoon some months after the incident, a letter arrived. Leo had drawn another picture inside it, this one showing a plane and a person with a cape, obviously incorrect in every technical sense, but precise as children's hearts are. He had written in a crooked hand, "Thank you. I sleep now." She kept that letter in the same wallet, next to the folded bedtime drawing. These were not trophies. They were the human artifacts of living through something and coming out the other side. She never allowed herself to think of that day as proof that she was special. It would have been a vanity to believe so. She preferred to think of it as confirmation of a principle she'd always lived by. When time is short, you do what is before you. If that sounds small, it is because the smallest things are almost always the most consequential. There was a quiet late service where the crew gathered, and the plane, its scarred skin now bearing new seams, was blessed in the way some groups bless tools, a murmur of hope and the honest desire for safer flights. Elena stood among them, shoulders in the shape of someone willing to keep working. People spoke of the fragile, the strong, of the way a minute can contain a universe. When the time came to leave, she walked back under the plane's shadow and felt the cool metal hum faintly through her soles. Years from then, when someone would ask her about the day, she would say with the flatness of someone attempting to be both honest and efficient, "We had 83 seconds left, and it was enough because people moved for one another." It is not a line designed to make a book jacket. It is a line designed to gather up a truth, small enough to fit in the palm. The C-17, for all its size and all its authority, had been only a stage. The actors on it, crew, passengers, medics, volunteers, had decided to keep a child's breath and an old woman's memory and a man's life within the thin ledger of human action. In the end, the engine's silence mattered because it forced the others to speak with their hands and their feet and their steady lungs. She kept the badge on her jacket for a long time and later slid it into a drawer when she decided she did not need visible proof. The world continued to have emergencies and kindnesses in equal measure. She answered calls and days and nights with the same small attention she always had. She learned tenderly to let the past be part of her, but not the book that wrote her identity. And sometimes, very quietly, when the sky was a pregnant blue, and the planes moved far above like birds that had learned to carry too much, she would find Leo's drawing and trace the number with a fingertip. 83 seconds. Those small units of time, once jammed into her like an iron law, had softened into a rhythm she could live beside. They taught her not that she was invincible, but that the margin between catastrophe and continuation is often measured in the way people choose to act without wanting reward or notice. We had 83 seconds left, and the C-17 had already lost both engines. Those seconds brought a thread of life that kept more than metal intact.